Okay, today's presentation is by Barbara Tuson. She will be speaking about a childhood in England in World War II. Barbara?
Yes, hi. As I said last week, it's not a really normal childhood because I was an army brat. George, do you have the slides?
Yes.
So the first one that I put up was a map of England, obviously, when you see it. The reason that I did this is because I wanted to show you where Southampton is, the city that, okay, I'll be talking about. Can we make it a bit bigger?
Yeah, just 1 second, Barbara.
Okay. Well, Southampton is on the very south coast of England and is obviously very vulnerable because of its location and also because it has a number of dockyards and also marshalling yards for railroad installations. It's also an old city. It has Roman walls and it has medieval fortifications. Can we see the next one, which I think is the castle? So this one is of a castle in the medieval fortifications of the city. Yes, that's it. And the next one is, please, George, is the house. This is the house I was born in and grew up in and was there in 1939 when war broke out. I was 4 years old. I don't remember a great deal about the house. I remember, though, my sister and I hovering behind the front door on Saturdays at about noon because my father would come with 2 ice cream cones and the tops were covered, I remember, in brown paper bags to stop them from melting. So on the day that war broke out, my father, who was in the Territorial Army and had fought in the First World War in France, went to rejoin his regiment, went to the army headquarters. His regiment was the Royal Corps of Signals. So there was my mother and myself and my sister in the house. And I think the next slide maybe, yes. So you've probably seen pictures of children being evacuated. And the scheme that was worked out prior to war breaking out was that the evacuation of children from these vulnerable cities like London and Southampton, Liverpool, would be by school. So my sister was at school, she was 7 years old. I was too young to be evacuated on my own, and my mother would not allow us to be separated. So the 3 of us joined my sister's school in our evacuation. The next slide, please. So we were evacuated to a village of Ferndown, which was well away from the city of Southampton. And why in Ferndown? This is a paragraph from a book written by a journalist, Brian Davis. The book is out of print, but he sent me this paragraph. So when war was declared, Ferndown was deemed to be safe from German bombs and thus became the home for a large number of evacuated children from Southampton. Some lived in requisitioned houses, but most were placed with households in the Ferndown area. Children attended Ferndown School for just half a day because the school could not accommodate the village children plus the evacuees. And I think next we have a picture of the village. Yes, typical English village, and it was actually rather nice. So my memory of evacuation was, I don't remember the journey to get to Ferndown. I do remember sitting in a village hall, which was crowded initially with children and a few teachers and some adults. And then the people from the village came and took the children back to their homes. And there would have been a census before the war which indicated how many rooms the houses had. And it was mandatory to take the number of evacuee children that you were mandated to take. So I do remember that the hall emptied out, and the three of us were just in there alone. And it must have been incredibly daunting for anyone to look at us and think, how am I going to take in a mother and two children? Eventually it happened. We stayed in a builder's house, and my sister went to school. My mother actually was required to work in that house, and I got to play in the builder's yard and shed at the back of the house. One day, I'd obviously been in under the builder's feet too often. I was wearing overalls. He picked me up and hung me on the shed wall on a nail, and I screamed, and I was a very good screamer, which was great because we left the builder's, I think it's the next screen, George. We left the builder's house and went to the home farm. I think, yes, thank you. This is the farm. Been in the same family for generations. It was a dairy farm, and the Trehanes, the people who owned it and were there at the time, were very warm and welcoming, and I remember it as a very pleasant time. I played in the farmyard, and I remember the barn where the cows were kept when they were calving, and eventually I was given, quotes, a Jersey calf, which they told me I could take care of. And I imagined this calf growing up to be a cow, but of course that never happened. So do we have Wolford in the next slide? No, we have rations, because we've been talking about, one of the things I did was help to churn cream into butter. And these are the typical rations of an adult in World War II. And I don't know if it's 4 ounces of bacon and ham, bacon and 4 ounces of ham, I have no idea, but this, I was amused by the other entry about other meat to the value of 1 shilling and 2pence, the equivalent to 2 chops. So what did you do? Each adult had 2 chops a week. I really don't know. Butter, 2 ounces, cheese, 2 ounces, and then margarine and cooking fats. Milk, 3 pints, but I think children were allotted another pint of milk, and when we get down to it, another fresh egg if they were available. I was surprised about the amount of sugar. Half a pound seemed a lot to me. And when we got to tea, my mother, along with everybody in Britain, was a tea drinker, and the 2 ounces of tea was very difficult for her. And at one point she had told me that had she been able to find an inroads into the black market, the one thing she would have bought was tea. Eggs were not always available, even though you're supposed to have one, but we did get dried egg, which tastes very disgusting. And the sweets are candy, which 12 ounces every 4 weeks, but I don't remember us being able to buy them. We weren't anywhere where we went to shops to buy sweets, and they weren't very important. Okay, come January 1940, my father was settled in a camp called Bulford Camp. It was on Salisbury Plain in the county called Wiltshire, and that's sort of central south England. We could join him because of the officers' housing. We were allotted one of these houses, and actually, excuse me, there were families of children in these houses. Next, I will show you a picture of the camp. This shows a very small portion because this camp was enormous and housed hundreds and hundreds of military. We'll go to the bird on top of the hill. If we have the next slide, there's a close-up of it. And the reason that it's there is because in 1918, New Zealand soldiers were billeted at the camp, and in November 1918, when the armistice was signed, they were ready to be repatriated, but it didn't happen because of dock strikes and the lack of shipping. So they were still there in the summer of 1919, and they rioted, and it was decided that what they needed was a work detail. And one of the sergeants had found a picture of a stuffed kiwi, which is the national bird of New Zealand, and they set to work to cut through to the chalk which underlies these hills and made this magnificent image of a kiwi. They also put NZ for New Zealand by it. Of course, in the Second World War, it was camouflaged. One day, my mother thought it would be great for us to go for a walk up what was known as Kiwi Beacon. It was not very steep, and I remember it was easy walking. And we got up to about where the Kiwis Beacon would have been, and we suddenly heard the drone of an airplane. My mother pulled us under what I think was a bush, because I remember it being prickly. We laid down flat, and within seconds, the plane came up over the brow of the hill, and it was above us. It was very loud and very, very noisy. So within seconds, it had passed over us and gone on down the hill. It was, in fact, an enemy bomber, which had probably lost its way and was going to dump its bombs wherever it could find a likely place. Luckily, it wasn't the camp. We didn't get bombed in that camp. The group of children, we used to play together, and in February of 1940, it was very snowy, and we started to make a snowball, and it got bigger and bigger and bigger, and in the end, we couldn't push it any further. I do know that I helped to do that because I can remember wet mittens and very cold hands. Well, where we left the snowball blocked one of the roads into the camp. And I don't know if anybody got into trouble for doing that, but I imagine the fathers were furious because they had to get a detail of soldiers from the camp to come and dig out the snowball. Where do we go next, George? Okay, the camp was just 2 miles from Stonehenge. Occasionally, one of the fathers would commandeer an army vehicle, and we would pile into the back and crouch down and be covered in blankets until we left the perimeter of the camp. And then we would go, and I now realize that was an incredibly privilege to be able to go and play among the stones of Stonehenge, because you really can't get anywhere close to it now. It rightly is cordoned off. In the next slide, George. This is an invitation that we received, and I have the original of it. It's on the floor, so I'm just going to get it. I'm getting the original because even that is not very clear, but at least it's clearer of this, and I'll be able to read it. I have it now. Okay, get back with this. It's an invitation, and I'll read it. It's to Officer Commanding, no, it's the Officer Commanding British and Indian officers and all ranks of the detachment, Indian contingent, Kiwi Barracks, Wolford Camp, Wiltshire, request the pleasure of the company of Captain and Mrs. Pike and Captain Campbell. And it's at 3:15 p.m. in Wolford Camp Garrison Gymnasium behind the Garrison Cinema. And it's to celebrate Idi Milad, which is the anniversary of the birthday of the Holy Prophet Muhammad, the founder of Islam. And the program, Indian songs and Indian folk dances, Punjabi and Kathak. Now, this contingent of Indian soldiers were actually Sikhs, and they wore white turbans on their heads. They wore Indian uniform, turbans on their heads. So what happened at these affairs is that we formed a receiving line. And really, I thought it should be the other way around. But anyway, this is what happened. My father, my mother, my sister, and I would stand in a line. And I was very well schooled in what you did on these occasions. You wore your party frock and white socks and Mary Janes and a bow in your hair. And when you were introduced to somebody who walked by, you smiled, you shook hands, and you answered a question if they asked you one. So on this occasion, okay, there were dark faces under these white turbans. And quite frankly, that was scary for me. So the parade of these soldiers went on, as far as I was concerned, far too long. And so finally, I did what I did on many occasions. I just burst into tears. But this was really frowned on because that wasn't something you did as a daughter of the regiment. We had several invitations to these sort of programs. And another one that I remember, I do remember this one very clearly, and I remember we didn't have tea. Okay, another one was...
excuse me, Barbara,
yes.
About how old were you at this time?
I was still 4.
Mm-hmm.
This is the beginning of 1940. My birthday was in May 1940, so I was still 4.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so another one of these occasions I do remember, there was a box of glowing coals on the floor, and Indians in traditional dress and their turbans would run across these coals barefoot. And again, I found that incredibly scary. I wondered why they didn't burn their feet. Okay, the next slide is of the Battle of Britain, I think. Yes. This paragraph is from Wikipedia, and they don't have the dates right. We had air raids at Bulford, almost from the time that we got there, but we really disregarded them and sheltered in a cupboard under the stairs until the all clear sounded. We actually never got bombed. I was never in any sort of bombing in any of the places I was during the war. Well, the enemy was sending planes over, and they were bombers, and they were escorted by fighters. And the fighters were the Messerschmitt and the Heinkel. We knew the names of all these planes, even as kids. And then we had the Spitfires and the Hurricanes, and they would engage in dogfights. So when this started in about April, we went down to the communal shelter every night at around 6 o'clock, even before the air sirens started. So it was usually just the mothers and children in the shelters, because the fathers were dealing with things in the camp. But on one occasion, I remember my father was down there, and he took each child by the hand and took us up the steps to see the dogfights were going up ahead over us. And on the occasion that he took me, one of the planes went down in flames, and he told me not to worry because that was surely an enemy plane. And I'm looking at actually at the ceiling here, because this impression of the planes fighting in the air is one that stays with me. I don't know where we're going next, George. Oops. Okay, so another of the places we were stationed where we could be with my father was at Burnham-on-Sea. And I think there's a picture of the Esplanade next. No. Okay, I put this map up because there's a tag to show where it is. It's on the Bristol Channel, and it's opposite Cardiff. And I mentioned that because from where we were, which was the 4th floor of a hotel on the Esplanade, we could see Cardiff night after night up in flames, because they received an incredible barrage of the Blitz bombing. Okay, next one is the Esplanade, I think. Yes, okay, so the hotel was right on the Esplanade, right opposite the beach. I couldn't find it, but the buildings are very similar. And our quarters were the top floor of the hotel, which had been the servants' quarters. And there were a couple of features that were amusing to us. If you watched Downton Abbey, there were bells along the wall, and they were here. And underneath were the number of the rooms of the hotel. They never rang because there were no residents in the hotel. Then the other feature was a dumb waiter, and we would use that, my sister and I. My sister organized a lending library. So there was the daughter of the proprietors who lived on the 1st floor was Anne, and we would exchange books from our lending library. We would send the dumbwaiter down, and Anne would send it up. We could play in the grounds of the hotel. On one occasion, we were chasing, and I put my hand through the plate glass window, one of the rooms downstairs. My father took me to the military headquarters looking for a doctor to stitch up my fingers. I had cut them all the way along on right hand at the base of the fingers. Well, there wasn't a doctor available, but there was an army medic. So I sat on my father's knee, I buried my head in his chest, and I got stitched up. Of course, there wasn't any niceties, nothing like local anesthetic or anything. So I buried my head in my father's chest so that we wouldn't hear me crying. And when we got home, my father said I was very brave. He told my mother, but he said I had bitten a chunk out of his chest, which of course was not true. It probably felt like it for him. And the next slide is, okay, the school. I don't know why this school was combined, but we went to Oakovers, and this is an advertisement for the school, which I found amusing, boarding and day school. The thing I picked out of this was modern education, and I cannot imagine what they considered was modern education. There was special dancing and keep fit. I did dance there, and I have a certificate for ballet from there. There were no playgrounds, but we used the beach as a playground. The next slide, I think, shows pupils on the beach, doesn't it, George? Yes. And these are just lolling around. They're not, okay. We had organized games on the beach, hockey and dodgeball, games like that. My sister and I and friends could use the beach also below the hotel for playing. And when my mother wanted us to come indoors, she would wave a big red scarf from one of the windows, and we'd occasionally be looking up there. When we saw the flag, we went home to lunch or whatever. Another thing I remember from Burnham is my father had a subaltern. His name was Subaltern Singleton. He used to introduce himself as Subaltern Singleton, sir, from Somerset Sub-District Signals. And I remember that very clearly. Anyway, he would go out to the cliffs and raid the seagull's nest for gulls' eggs. And he would bring these back to my father, and we would have them boiled in an egg cup, just like you would a fresh egg, a hen's egg. And I do remember that they tasted fishy, but they were a lot better than the powdered egg that we had in place of normal eggs, which really were in short supply. And the next one is, yes, okay, so we were there for a year, and really, we never had an air raid. It was really an idyllic situation, and you could forget that the war was going on. Although above the cliffs was this very ominous-looking gun emplacement, which would have been manned during the war, and the guns would be obviously facing the coast. And where do we go next, George? Okay, so my father was posted to a camp which was right in line of the buzz bombs. Those were the V1 and V2 rocket bombs, which had been developed in Germany. And you could hear the buzz bomb as it came over. You could hear the drone of the bomb. But all of a sudden it cut out, and the bomb dropped. And that was really scary for people, because they knew if they were underneath the drone, it was fine, but they never knew where the bomb was going to drop. And my father actually had one of those bombs dropped on the camp, and he lost a number of soldiers in one of the barracks. When we moved to Tilehurst, we were living with my grandmother. My mother was ill. She had pneumonia, and she was in hospital. So my father asked our housekeeper, Mrs. Whitfield, to take me to school. And you probably gathered that I'd been privately educated all along, and our classes were never more than 12 pupils. So we get to this school, which was a public school, and we went into the headmistress's office. And I answered the usual questions, name, address, and we came down to, what is your father's name? And I looked at this strange woman across the desk, and I thought, how rude you are. How could you possibly ask such a personal question? And so I said, I didn't know. So Mrs. Whitfield told me, well, doesn't your mother call him Stan? And I agreed. So he went down as Stanley Pike, as my father. In actual fact, when he was born, he had 4 older sisters, and they decided to name him. And the names they gave him were Reginald, Stanley, Victor, and the surname was Pike. So he went all through life with the initials RSVP. So I was taken into a classroom, and all I saw was a sea of faces. There were 36 pupils in this classroom, and I had been used to no more than 12 in one of the schools I'd attended classrooms. Education was magnificent, and it was very intense. And it was found that I was a year behind in arithmetic, and so my teacher took me to the blackboard with a piece of chalk. Every time the whole class trooped out to go to the assembly in the mornings, I performed amazing things that I had no idea what were, like long division and fractions and decimals and all sorts of things. I don't think they went into my head very well. I was always dyslexic about arithmetic. The reason why the teaching at this point was so intense is because in the March of 1945, we were required to sit an exam which was called the scholarship. It would allow you to go to one of the selective schools in Reading. So I remember being in a large hall, the desk was separated. We had blue books with numbers, not names on them. We had a number 2 pencil, and okay, turn over the papers, the exam papers. The first one was English, and it was comprehension and composition and grammar. And that took about an hour. And the second test was called an intelligence test. And I think it would probably now be called reasoning. That was about half an hour. And the arithmetic test took another hour. So then, you know, school got back to normal. And we come forward to May 1945. The 8th of May was my sister's birthday. It was always the day, also the day that victory was announced in Europe. I think I have my letter next, don't I, George? Okay, so just to give you an idea of the victory celebrations, this was a letter, my father was still away. This was a letter I wrote to him on the 11th of May, 1945. And it reads, because I'll read it because this is 9-year-old score. My dear Daddy, I hope you are well. I am. Thank you very much for the victory present you sent me. And for the life of me, I can't remember what that was. I expect you were surprised to hear I passed the scholarship. Mummy was. When the letter came, I had to pinch her. She thought she was dreaming. I bought Mary a book called The Girl Guide Book of Games. That was her birthday present from me. Oh, on victory night, I went to bed at 6:30 and Mummy woke us up at 10:20. Very precise. We dressed and went into the road where a big bonfire was burning. We sang songs and danced. We had a party in the road and sports in the rec. And that pretty much tells you about the celebrations that went on. They went on all over England like that, bonfires and parties, dancing and singing in the roads on VE night, and then again, I think on VJ night. Now, George found a clip of Winston Churchill giving his victory speech, and he couldn't show it while he was on, what is this, PowerPoint? But he could show it now, which we thought would be a good ending to this talk.
One minute.
Good.
Oh, what happened with?
You'll find it. I know you will.
I will. Let me take one. Meanwhile, you can, you can ask some questions till I find this. By the way, great talk.
Thank you very much.
It's very good.
Very interesting.
Barbara?
Yeah, you just go ahead and ask
Well, if
questions.
anybody has any questions, I'd be pleased to answer them. Henry seems to have.
I don't have any questions particularly, but I think that's terrific that you're able to present your story while you were like 4 to 9 years old, I guess.
4 to 9, yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And to have kept that letter that you sent to your daddy, I think that's terrific. That's just,
Yes.
and for you to tell us that and describe it as well as you did, I think it's just wonderful.
Yes.
And I
Well, thank you, Henry.
Yeah.
Nobody else.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Lee.
Okay. That was really phenomenal. That really was. So yeah, it was very interesting. And I have my nephew's, mother was part of a group that came from Germany. There was a Kindersport, they called it.
Yeah.
Because they sent them from Germany to England during the war. So that was, in the schools, and that was Bee Rose's memories. And she's 90 already. Yes.
Yes.
So
Well, I
That's
know we
interesting.
had
I think Anne
we
Marie.
had refugees from Germany
Yeah.
actually in our school after the war, 1945.
Okay. I lived in London from 30th of August 1952 until early part of August the following year. And I'll never forget, 1st of April 1953, the rationing ended.
Yes.
We could go out and buy candies. At
Yes.
that time, I worked at St. Pancras Hospital, and we could get a little more meat, butter, and things like that. But the candy
Yes.
lines to the sweet shops were many, many times around the block.
Yeah.
Yes,
It's amazing it went on until 1952.
yes, 53 actually.
Yes, okay.
Yeah, because the coronation was in May, and that was another big thing I don't think I ever forget either.
Yes. Well,
Yeah.
7 years after
Thank-
the war, we were still rationed. That's totally amazing.
Right,
Yeah.
yeah. Fantastic memory, Barbara. That was
Yes.
delightful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
yes.
Marty.
During the war, apparently in England, they had very few color magazines. The ink was rare. So a
Yes.
friend of mine and I worked with the British Information Office in Rockefeller Center. We collected photographs, piles and piles of from magazines, not the newspapers. In those days, the newspapers were black and white. But we collected them and we brought them to her. And I still somewhere have a letter that I got from her thanking us for what we did, because this went on for a very long time. So that was my contribution.
Oh, sounds good.
It was amazing that you saved some of these documents, that letter and the list of rations, and
Yes.
there were some other
Yeah.
you really kept sort of like a scrapbook or something.
No, my mother kept everything, and I have a big cedar box that we call the archives. So before I knew I was going to give this talk, I just went through as many of the archives as I possibly could. There's more stuff in there, but I fished out what I thought would be relevant. And it's not up to me. I've kept them, but my mother was the one that saved them. She saved every school report from when I first entered school, kindergarten, right through to when I left high school, which was helpful because it gave you the dates of when we were where.
Wow.
Marty?
Those of us that went through the war remember the rationing.
Yes.
Every family got a ration book. I
Mhm.
have
Yes.
every one of them here that I saved. You talk about saving things. The children wore identification tags, just in case something happened, they at least know who the kid belonged to. I have those. I have mine and my sister's. And
I never
I
had
have that.
those. Those
I
were-
have that too, Marty. Marty, I
Yeah.
have that also, that tag that we wore. Did you have it, George? The
I
tag?
don't remember a tag at all.
I have it.
It's a round plastic tag with a number on it.
Right.
got it.
right.
You got it.
And we were told in case we got separated from our families, they would know where we belonged.
I think I was expendable.
I didn't get one either. Maybe New York didn't do it.
Me,
And we're talking about New York.
I don't remember Long Island either. But I do
No.
remember the war going with my father when he was on duty to go on a roof here, there to look for
Yeah.
planes and all that. And
And
he
air
would
aid
take
warden.
with air raid
Yes.
warden. Right, right.
Yes.
I think Marcy had her hand up.
Oh, she's muted. Marcy's muted.
You're muted.
Unmute yourself now.
Down.
You have to unmute yourself, Marcy.
I'm trying.
Okay.
There
I
you
think in the I think in the movie 1917, which is one of the last films I saw. Did I see that with you? I think I saw
Yes, you
that with you.
did.
Yes,
Yes, you
yes.
did.
And,
Yes.
and remember the Sikh, there were Sikh men serving with the Brits.
Just one, wasn't there?
Right.
Yes,
Yeah,
right.
yeah,
On the,
That was,
on the
uh,
lorry.
Yes,
Right.
yes.
right.
Very, very impressive, and they were incredible soldiers, incredible fighters.
Marilyn Lett.
Yeah.
Barbara, that
Yes.
was absolutely amazing. What I
Thank you.
think was so amazing was that as a child, you lived through these bombings and everything.
Mm.
And I think that's what makes the Brits so strong. My husband was stationed there before the invasion. He was an
Yes.
officer, so he lived very well. He was in London over Dulcie's shoe store. And
Wow.
when we went over there, he had to show me where he lived. And he
Absolutely.
said, the Brits are absolutely amazing. The bombs were flying over and the
Yep.
women were in the shopping and looking in the store windows, never batted an eye. They were so strong. And I think that picture that he painted for me has stayed with me forever. Barbara, I loved every minute of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, that was fascinating.
I think Sheila, yeah.
Yeah, Barbara, I was at Stonehenge when you were allowed to go up to it and around it.
Yes, yes.
And since then, they closed it, I hear. My children went there and they could not go close to it.
No.
It's all
No.
gated or roped off now.
Yes, it
But,
is.
yeah.
It's,
I did-
it's
was
an
it
amazing,
crumbling?
amazing place to visit.
Was Stonehenge crumbling? Is that why it's?
No, it's just to preserve it. It isn't crumbling, but hordes and hordes of people wandering over it probably would eventually. And I think it's right that they have roped it off.
Yes.
As I say,
That's
I
great.
feel very privileged to have been there when it wasn't.
So Barbara, when did you leave London?
I was never in London. I was in
Hello.
Southampton.
But what,
and
did you marry there?
I married in England. I lived there for about 8 years, have 4 children. And in 1967, we immigrated to America. My husband took up a job in upstate New York, Binghamton. And we've been here ever since.
Okay.
So,
Well, how did you find this place from all the way up in Binghamton?
well, I'll tell you, actually, we had moved to Boston. And my daughter, who's a flight attendant, bought a condo down here in Hollywood. And we came down for vacations. But I had told my husband when we first immigrated we came into Fort Lauderdale, we took the children down to Miami. to the, not the zoo, but the aquarium. And the journey was down what I think would have been Route 1. And there were all these houses and strip malls and what have you. And I made my husband promise that when we retired, we would never come to Florida. Well, my daughter being here and the fact that she had this condo and she was going to sell it. And we hummed and hawed, my husband and I, and we said, well, don't sell it to us. And we'll come down for vacations. But in actual fact, we came down here to live. Lived in a condo, and then we both came here before he died.
Lou, did you have a comment?
Yeah, it's you're talking about England during the war. I'm just reading The Splendid Wild by Eric Lawson, and the tremendous leadership Churchill provided when it seemed like it was hopeless transforming years and all sorts of encouraging words to the public, and the leadership was fantastic. Unfortunately, today we don't do anything close to that.
Lou, I know Eric Lawson. What is the name of this book?
Sacrifice on everybody's part. It's an amazing book.
On that note, we will go on. We will go out with Winston.
Okay.
Yesterday morning at 2:41 a.m. at General Eisenhower's headquarters, General Jodl, the representative of the German High Command, and of Grand Admiral Dönitz, the designated head of the German state, signed the act of unconditional surrender of all German land, sea, and air forces in Europe to the Allied Expeditionary Forces and simultaneously to the Soviet High Command. Hostilities will end officially at 1 minute after midnight tonight, Tuesday, the 8th of May. We may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing. Today is Victory in Europe Day. Tomorrow will also be Victory in Europe Day. But let us not forget for a moment the toils and efforts that lie ahead. Japan, with all her treachery and greed, remains unsubdued. The injuries she has inflicted upon Great Britain, the United States and other countries, and her detestable cruelties call for justice and retribution. We must now devote all our resources to the completion of our task, both at home and abroad. Advance, Britannia. Long live the cause of freedom. God save the King.
Wow.
Great.
Yeah.
Great.
Ah,
That was amazing.
yes.
Thank you again, Barbara.
Yes,
Yeah.
that was terrific. That was a
Yeah.
nice ending, George. Thank you for finding that.
That is only because
Oh, wait,
they find an echo in the breasts of those
wait a
of
second.
every land and of every race who love freedom
Well, I can't
and are
find
the
it.
foes of tyranny.
Okay, Rora.
Wow.
Okay, that was really excellent.
Mm,
Memories, yeah.
yeah, thank you, George.
Okay.
It was an amazing feat on the part of the British.
I do thank George because he worked so hard with me for
Not
to
really.
get the slides
No.
up together.
Well, actually, they've improved the PowerPoint and with the web. It's very easy to do these things compared to what it was, 10, 20.
Right.
George is getting to be a pro.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I'm getting all
George,
this,
I'll hire you. I'll hire you for my talk.
getting all this
Are you
experience.
for hire?
No, but actually, it's very easy. They've
That wasn't a
simplified.
question.
Yeah.
Answer the
Oh, yeah,
question. Are you for
definitely.
hire?
No, definitely, yes.
Okay.
You know, I can't
I'm
help
on
but
then.
think,
I'm on.
as
Okay.
American kids, we knew what was going on, but we never had the threat of bombing. Yeah,
No.
we had blackout curtains and all that stuff, but to have lived through the actual bombing.
We had a lot of air raid drills at PS 20. We had
Yeah.
to lay on the floors. They were
Right.
dirty.
Right.
And we had white middies on and dark skirts. We laid on the floors a lot, and they taped
We
up
were
all
never
our
bombed. We never went through that. I think
No.
the
Never
kids
through
in
that.
Israel, they're brought up with it. The kids in Israel are
I-
brought